Hey there, Thomas. Thanks for joining us on the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm excited to dig in. I'm intrigued about some of the topics we're going to talk about here today, and I know that our listener is going to be intrigued as well. But before we dive in, take a moment, let everybody know where you're coming from, what's your role in education, and what's going on in your world right now.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, again, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here and talk math, one of my favorite things to talk about. My name is Tom Nobley. I come from Connecticut, so East Coast of the U.S. Live in a town about hour and a half north of New York City. So to give people a sense. And yeah, I've had many roles in education. Currently, I am a consultant. I do some work for a educational nonprofit here in the state, and then I also have my own math consulting company as well that I've recently started and trying to build up a little bit.
Gotcha. Well, the question we ask everybody is about your math moment. So when we think back, your history with math, usually it's a moment that when we say like math class, something pops in your mind. Like it's like you can't help it when you hear the word, like this image that maybe you experienced, but also kind of stuck with you throughout the years. But when I say math class, like what moment comes to mind?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question because I know it's one that is always asked on the show. And it was interesting because I was thinking it's like hard for me to pin down a specific moment where I felt like there was something really kind of like, seminal about it. I feel like a lot of my math class experience, which is kind of like a blended blob of kind of the same type of just like very passive experience. I mean, where, it was about getting the right answer and didn't necessarily, I mean, I guess one that really sticks out that if I had to pick, and when I was a sophomore, I took geometry. And I remember that the teacher, it was like we would just come in, we'd have an assignment, we'd have to, do it. And if we had any questions, her answer was always, well, it's in the book. And so, and again, I really didn't want to pick a negative one, but it was just like, and I wouldn't say it was a scarring experience or anything. It just, there was nothing that really, it was just kind of all just like, okay, this is math. You come in, and I was always okay at it, did fine, was able to
Right.
memorize stuff. But I just didn't really, it just wasn't really anything that did anything for me until I started getting into teaching it. And then that's when it really opened up for me.
Interesting. I think I feel the same experience. It was like math was just like this class we did, and if you caught on quick with patterning, really, because it's like patterning of examples, patterning of how the algebra worked. Like if you could catch on quick, like you could be like, I can show up, I can do the work, and I can move on.
Yeah,
Like,
I
and
mean that's kind of
it's
what it was. And I just didn't really, it was just like, all right, like it just didn't really, resonate. And like obviously as a teacher now and working with teachers, we're all about the experience we want kids to have in math class. And we want kids to have that experience to resonate with them and to build their self-efficacy and make them believe in their ability to do math. And I mean, I didn't really, it was just kind of a very neutral, like you said, just kind of a very neutral existence as a
sure.
student.
Sure. Where would you say that transition happened for you? Like I know for me it was like it was years in, like 10 years in where I was getting frustrated and I knew I needed to kind of take a different approach, and I took a step in a different direction for a little bit. But like where was that transition for you to be like, was it immediate getting into teaching where like, oh my gosh, like I have to completely, give it, the children and the students a different experience than what I had, because I didn't do it that way. I kind of like just emulated what I experienced for a long time. Or did you have were you like me, where it's like you realized something had to change? Tell me about that kind of transition or an introduction.
Yeah, yeah. So no, kind of similar to you, right? I started out in teaching. I taught just like a small private school to begin with, and I just very much did kind of the way I was taught, right? And a lot of the way I was trained, unfortunately, which was just very similar. Kind of I do, you do, we do stuff. Again, not really paying so close attention to whether kids necessarily had the conceptual understanding, just like if they were able to, pass the tests and that kind of thing. And then I moved districts. I started teaching sixth grade math in it might be number two now, but at the time it was a large urban district in Connecticut. So it was a different population. And I started teaching, and about a year or two in, I kind of like it was going okay, but I felt like I could see that there was probably a need to kind of do things differently, especially, having kids coming with the diversity of experience that they did. And so I ended up, I don't even remember how, but I ended up like reading about the Timms study.
Hmm.
And so I got really interested in like that. And so I watched all the videos and I started to read some of the work around it. And then that kind of led me to like this idea of, well, they don't teach math like this everywhere, actually, right? So what are they doing? And at that point it was like in Japan and China. But then I just kind of got hooked and I started reading other things, looking into other research and I started just trying to, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna just try this in my classroom and see what happens. And also kind of learn along the way, right? Because like I had to learn like why does this work? Or,
Hmm.
like why when
Hmm.
we're dividing fractions, because like I just knew it worked, I could do it. But
Sure.
and so I would just try stuff and I could kind of just gauge and see what was happening and like I could see the kids were more into it and I just kept kind of going and I just became hooked at that point and just kept like read everything I could find, worked with colleagues and math coaches and started, go to conferences and just tried to learn. And then I would just try things. I had a really supportive principal at the
Hmm.
time who was just like really like, yeah, you try it. Anything you need from me, so I didn't feel like it was like anything constraining me. And that just kind of, yeah, it just kind of took off from there. And then once, I just started to see what that experience could be like and the response of the students and yeah, I was hooked. But so
Awesome.
it's definitely probably
Yeah.
about 4 or 5 years into my career.
Right. So let's chat about instructional recipes. This is the intriguing. You're working with teachers. You're supporting teachers these days. But talk to us about like what is an instructional recipe? Fill us in because I think that's a relatively new phrase that I think a teacher wouldn't have heard about.
Yeah.
And your take on it.
Yeah. So the way this came about, previous to me kind of doing some consulting, I was in a district as a central office administrator. I was director of elementary math and science of another district here in Connecticut. And we were doing some work trying to bring about change using, and we were getting some training in this idea, in this methodology of improvement science,
Hmm.
uh, which is all very much about kind of small test changing, collecting data, trying to get better. And so one of the things that they talk about in improvement science is this idea, and the term is not, I wish they didn't call it this because when people hear the term, they kind of like shut down a little bit because it's,
Hmm.
but they, in the realm of improvement science, they call it standard work.
Okay.
Yeah, people kind of get turned a little off about that. But basically, this idea that if you're in a system, any system, there's probably a best way to do something, whatever that task is. There's probably like and that way could evolve, right? If we think about like in a medical field or something, the best way to do a knee surgery now is not the best way it was. So it's not that it can't change, but and so the idea is like we should probably figure out a way to codify the best way that we know how to do something and help people to do it that way, so that um you have kind of less variance in the system. And then when you're talking about people, like especially students, like their experience from class to class is equitable. So this idea was kind of interesting. And I, of course, was working with teachers. And one of the things that we had done a lot of work in the districts was this idea of having a common vision of what good instruction should look like,
Hmm.
specifically math, is again also important. So again, for the same reasons in terms of providing equitable experience to kids. But one of the questions I would always get is, Tom, get it? Like these are the components of high quality instruction, right? We need to have kids, working on rigorous tasks. We need to have feedback. But like, what does that look like? Like, okay, 2 o'clock in my third grade class, I'm doing this. Like how? And so that was obviously with I had a team of great coaches, and So I started thinking about this idea of standard work, and I said, and colleagues of mine as well, not just me, um, started to think about like what would that look like in teaching, basically. So we settled on the recipe metaphor because for a couple reasons. So one of the things that we tried to shift is it's not about the individual teacher. Like we don't want to be judging the individual teacher. We really want to be just focusing on how do we refine the practice to be the best it can be. So when you think about a recipe, so the example I always use with teachers, like if I ask you to try my blueberry muffin recipe and then tell me, what you think, you might come back and say, oh, it was good, but like I had to, on my oven, I had to use a different temperature because it's a gas and not electric. Or somebody else might say, well, you might want to try,
Right.
put, something different here and there, whatever the case may be. And I know when you're telling me that you're not saying that I'm a bad cook. You're just critiquing the recipe. And I think that was that has been a useful frame for teachers because so what we did, particularly in the math world, is we said, all right, what are some of the high leverage practices that we know we want and we know should be happening? So, for instance, things like launching the task, consolidating the learning, conferring, and we started to look at the research and we started to say, what would that look like if we kind of codified some of the key points there? And the idea of a recipe is not a script, right? It's not here's a script that you're just going to follow, because we know that teaching cannot be reduced to a script. But basically, it gives folks kind of some moves and some things to keep in mind as they're teaching so that they don't have to focus all their energy on thinking of all those things and they can pay more attention to what kids' thinking is and respond. But it's trying to balance because we know that teaching is a very high cognitive load activity. I mean, there's so much going on, it taxes. So the idea is if we can reduce some of that so that you can pay more attention to responding to students, let's try it out. So we started to just kind of develop these recipes and kind of get teams of teachers together, kind of give them the spiel I just gave you about what a recipe is and how it came about. Then say, will you try this in your classroom and give us feedback about like, because we need to know, like in different contexts and different schools with different kids, will you let us know how it goes? And so people did, and we started to get good feedback in terms of how it helped or if working with a coach um, and so we would call them these recipe testing sessions, and we would just work with teams of teachers, and we'd go through a recipe, and then we'd make sure everyone kind of was like, okay, this is what we're going to do, and then we might look at a particular task or something that we were going to try it with. We'd try it. People would kind of collect different types of data in terms of like how will we know that this recipe is good, basically, like how we, and then we'd come back and talk about it, and then teachers would give us feedback. We'd make tweaks and we would try to, and we didn't think of that. And it just started to kind of become this process. And, we were keeping different data points throughout the year on different things, both process data points and outcome data points. But at the end of the year in Connecticut, kids take obviously a state test and all that kind of stuff. And, we saw some really good results there as well, like actually double digit increases in proficiency. So, so we have this whole slew basically of recipes, which again are kind of like what's the best known way of launching a task, for instance, or what's the best known way of um, consolidating the learning, or how should we answer kids' questions? We pulled from a lot of different things, and a lot of them use some of the Peter Lilladall's work in building thinking classrooms. We've referenced Kathy Fosno's work. We've referenced a couple other folks as well in terms of trying to bring that together for folks. And so that's kind of the idea. And, it's been really, as I said, it puts teachers in a position, I think that they should be in, but they not have always been in, where they're the ones who are kind of, okay, I'm doing research in my own practice and I'm giving you feedback. So we've reversed the flow of feedback, typically, at
Right.
least in the US with teacher evaluation and things like that. Someone like me would come in, say, I need you to, you're going to do this recipe, and then I'm going to tell you how well you did it. And we basically flipped the script on that and said, will you actually try this out in your classroom and tell us how it went and give us feedback because you're the one who's actually implementing it and you're the one who's actually has the expertise in the classroom. And so we've kind of flipped that. Um, and then we also interviewed kids. The other thing we did too on this is after teachers would start kind of shifting, right, using these as a ways to begin to just kind of shift the way they would do things. We talked to kids and say, so, your teacher's been doing some things a little bit differently in math class. Tell us about that. And they had all, and we would share that with the teachers as well. And the student data was also really telling because they were really positive things to say about, for instance, I like working in random groups because I get to work with different friends, or I like that the teacher doesn't help us too much and I have to think of that by myself. And I feel so smart and all these kinds of things. So it kind of reinforced, I think, also for teachers that, this is definitely useful. And again, the whole idea was just trying to support teachers to think about how can we make it, how can we kind of concretize some things so that it's easier for folks to be able to, well, not easier, but require less cognitive resource to pull that off in the classroom because there's so many things going on, so that you could focus more attention on kind of responding to student learning, instead of having to think through every little thing. And then, over time, um, as teachers worked on them more, tried them more, they made little tweaks and things that, for their class, just like you would expect, of course, like, well, they might, I do it slightly different, because of this or that. And like I said, we also got, because the other thing is it's the best known way of how to do something today, but that doesn't mean it's
Sure.
the best known way tomorrow. We got all kinds of feedback from teachers and different things of, oh, that's a really good idea. We should write that in, because we never thought about that. And so we would tweak, and so it became this really, I think, just a different way of leveraging teacher teams in a school to kind of move toward a vision of what high quality mathematics instruction could look like. And instead of the focus being on trying to change the individual teacher, the focus was on leveraging the power of teams to work together, and kind of research their own practice and figure out how to make these things work. And then give us feedback so that we could ask other people to try and see what happened. And that it became kind of that. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so we've got, a slew of them that we've developed, and in my work now, obviously, I'm able to start to work with teachers in different districts and in, different contexts, and kind of bring this idea and say, can we try this, and work with coaches to, we did a lot of work with coaches as well to think about how, as a coach, what's your role in this process and things like that. So.
What, like, paint us a picture? Like, what I'm imagining here is that, maybe this is where the clarifying, comes from, is that you're saying we've looked at different approaches, we've looked at, different techniques and strategies, to do, say, different things in the classrooms, and now we're trying to provide, say, that guidance to teachers. So what does it say look like? Is it, are you, say, providing teachers, say, a lesson plan that says this is for this particular grade and this particular level? Or is it like, here's like a collection of tools that you can put in your tool belt, and then it's not specific to that particular grade or that particular concept, but it can help you implement it in that. So, like, tell us, like, what does this look like in a teacher's hands?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so it's much more like the latter. So not lesson specific, not test. So it might be, so I'll just use the launching the task one, right? So we have this
Sure.
idea, what do we want to launch a task? So we know some things, and a lot of this, Peter Liljedahl's work. We want to get kids moving within 5 minutes of starting the class, right? So, and we want to have kids, and then standing, or we want to, and we want to make sure that when we launch the task, we don't overteach into it, right? We don't lower the cognitive demand of the task before kids have a chance to do it. So the recipe is much more just like, hey, here's some things you want to keep in mind, pay attention to when you're launching the task, whatever task it is. Now, what we might do is, if we're working, let's say I was working with a group of fourth grade teachers and we were going to try this recipe out, we might say, well, let's all look at a similar task to try it with, because we might want to, like, develop the launch script together. We may want to, like, and to say, well, what happens if we send kids off and they don't know what to, they like, what might we do there? So we might apply it to a specific, but the recipes themselves are just about what we consider high leverage instructional practices, not not a lesson plan, not
Right. Okay.
specific tasks. So they can be applied throughout, whatever curriculum you're using, whatever task you're using. The other thing we tried to do with them too is really make so that we a lot of the work that I'm doing now with colleagues and at the time was looking at this idea in terms of instructional equity. So, there's certainly equity is a major issue and a major conversation in the educational landscape today. But we found in our work with teachers and schools that a lot of times instruction and equity were not seen as the same. They weren't seen as merged. There was, and
Hmm.
so we started to talk about, a lot. Kids spend most of their times in classes,
Sure.
and there is certainly variance in the quality of instruction, unfortunately, that different kids receive, and sometimes, kids who are more marginalized tend not to receive as quality of instruction as others, unfortunately. So what we also tried to do with these practices was kind of flesh out and say, well, certain practices are more equitable than others because they're less susceptible to teacher biases. So, for example, random grouping, right?
Hmm.
I can't, if I'm not in charge of making the group, even any biases that I may have unconscious, or whatever, can't creep in because the group is random, right? So, for example, we also tried to pick practices that were less susceptible to that and more equitable to start putting into practice as well in these recipes so that and the other piece too, right? We would get from teachers sometimes, right? Always out of a good place, but oh, I'm not sure that I can do this because I have a high population of kids with IEPs or special education students or ML, and we would always just be, well, let's just try it. Let's just see what happens. You're giving us feedback, right? We just want to know, and so in certain situations where in a classroom all the kids might not have had that experience because there might have been separate kind of like, okay, this group's going to do this and this group's going to do this. When we were involved in these recipe testing sessions, we said, well, let's just do it with all the students and see what happens. And that was really powerful too, because many, many times kids were doing things that teachers didn't think they could do. And so that set us up to then say, oh, well, let's try that again and see what happens, right? So there was definitely kind of an equity piece to it as well, in terms of trying to make the experiences that kids are having in classrooms as equitable as possible, as high leverage as possible, so that, it really wasn't, again, right? The ultimate goal is like, we don't want the quality of your education to be dependent on which teacher you get. And
Right.
so if we can all be using some common practices that we know the research supports are high leverage, are maybe more equitable, are going to, really put the learner in the forefront, can we try to figure out how to make those work together? Because the other thing too is I think it's really hard as an individual teacher to try and just like figure all this out as if you're
Well, it's everyone's going back to the drawing board, right? So it's like unless you've had training, specific training on these ideas, you're kind of guessing at what is the best practice today. What should I be doing if I'm trying to engage my students this way? Like I'm on your site right now, and I'm looking at, say, the recipe for hints and extensions. Like I think people, it's like, how do I give a hint? Like maybe I'll just give a hint. Am I doing the hints the right way? Like that's a common question that we have. And then I think I like that it is general enough that say these are the things that happen in our classrooms on a regular basis, and then what could I do if I'm looking for guidance in that area?
right.
And you're giving those suggestions. So I guess if we go down the rabbit hole for a sec about hints and extensions, like walk us through, like what does that look like knowing that, say, the listener right now can't see what I see on the screen.
Yeah, so generally what we'll do with a recipe is we have a little description of like what the practice is and why it's high leverage at the top. And then we kind of have the process. So usually there's pre-work.
Hmm.
So it built out into, okay, here's pre-work, and then here's the actual process, and then here's maybe some additional considerations. So with like hints and extensions, the pre-work is obviously like you want to know the task that you're going to be um, doing with the children well.
Yep.
Want to start to anticipate where what types of hints students might need and what types, and obviously have your, how you're going to extend it, because thinking of that, obviously you can't always anticipate all of that, but trying to think of that all in the moment is really hard, back to that cognitive load piece. And the thing we say about pre-work too, especially whether it's hints and extensions or anything else, is you're thinking about what and where, like what types of hints and extensions I might give and where in the lesson I might give them, but you're not deciding who.
Right.
You're not deciding who until you actually have evidence that of who needs them, right? Sometimes, and I know even like back when I was, getting training and stuff, we would often make decisions about what students could do before we even gave them a chance to do
Sure.
it. Right? Oh, well, I'm going to have these hints ready for Johnny because, Johnny always struggles. And so we always tell teachers, we're not telling you not to have the what and the where, but let's not decide on the who until we actually give them a chance to do it. And then in the moment, as Julie Dixon uses the terms just in case, just in time, that we've used that language with teachers. I think they grab onto it. Like, let's not give them the hint just in case they need it. Let's
Right.
give it to them just at a just in time moment. So we go through the pre-work, and then, it talks about the process. And then so there'll be kind of different steps to think about, different hints to think about, or different practices to think about when giving hints and extensions. So it'll talk about,
Sure.
if you notice a group is, having a hard time or at a stuck point, here's how you might approach them. Here's what you might do. You might give the hint. It talks about in Peter Liljedahl's book, he talks about the two different types of hints, right? Hints to increase ability, hints to decrease challenge. It talks about what those are and why you might give them. But then, it'll give it'll like, I'm particularly on that recipe as well. It'll say, look, if you find yourself always having to give a hint to decrease challenge because kids are at a kind of a frustration point, and you're like, I got to bring this down really quick or I'm going to lose them,
Hmm.
that's an indication that your timing's off, right?
Right.
Because if you're late, basically, you're getting there too late. So you might want to think about
Hmm.
how you can, right? Because really, obviously, we want to be giving hints to increase ability. They take longer, and so then there's some suggestions it gives on there for, well, so maybe, because a lot of things the teacher I find too, and is the teachers are trying to give, like, they'll try to go to each group, right, and give hint, and so, but they don't always think about how to leverage a group they just met with to help another group, right? So they're trying to actually be the one that kind of intervenes. And sometimes you can buy yourself some time so that you can get that timing right, to be like, you know what, why don't you go talk to, group number three, because they just had a really similar question and we talked about it, and so leveraging that knowledge mobility. So just tips like that to, like,
Hmm.
hey, if you're finding yourself late, are you trying to do everything yourself, or are you actually leveraging the knowledge in the room
Right.
as well, to so that you don't have to? Because if you're trying to do it all yourself, likely you're never going to be able to get the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
so
Right.
just like things like that. So again, not scripts, but just like, here's things to think about. If you find this
Hmm.
happening, you might want to try this, if it, that kind of thing. And then it talks about extensions, and it talks about the different types of extensions,
Sure.
uh, particularly in that framework, and talks about what, when you might want to give
Right.
the,
Yeah.
maybe to extend. If it's a thin slicing task, this type of extension is probably more useful. If it's more of an open-ended task, then you're going to want to probably use one of these types of extensions.
Right.
So things like that. And again, just so that you kind of have those guardrails going in. Again, we can't script out everything that's going to happen, because that's a classroom is a dynamic,
Sure.
semi-chaotic system, and there's no way to, you can't predict.
Right.
But we're just trying to make it easier for teachers
Sh-
to be able to
Right.
make those decisions,
Yeah.
and take some of them off their plate.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Now, when I'm looking at these recipes, you've got to think, pair, share recipe. You got to, like, what do you do with cold calling on students, consolidating the lesson, how to answer questions from students. So when you think about all of the, say, recipes you've been building and putting together, and you think about, like you talked about pre-work. So thinking about, like, what does like, if a teacher is going to be flexible in the moment to utilize, say, these recipes, if the teacher is going to, put these into action, if you think about all the recipes you've been building, like, is there any common things teachers need, say, to get to be strong at or to think about before they engage in say utilizing some of these recipes? What would you say is like, if you could pick one thing, like what's one thing that'd be like a teacher should be strong here before they can say engage in a lot of these best practices in the classroom?
Well, obviously, I mean, from a management perspective, I mean, if you have a teacher that is still maybe a newer teacher or something that's still like trying to just get like their management and transition routines down, I would probably, suggest that, they do that first before you try to do so. Although some of these have some of that built in. Um, but if you're trying to deal with kind of thinking in a classroom, you're trying to deal with, okay, managing what's going on with students and making and getting your routines underway, and you're trying to do things at an instructional level. I mean, that's really hard to do. Um, so I would say, if it's a newer teacher or something like that, we might want to make sure, okay, we feel comfortable just like kind of with the class and
Sure.
having kind of a community that feels good. But really beyond that, and in the recipes, I think, just like any instructional practice, some of them are easier to implement and some of them are harder, right? So like something like a think, pair, share is that's one we start with a lot because it's not that,
Sure.
first of all, most teachers are doing some version of that anyway.
Right.
That's the other thing, I should mention when we talk to teachers, okay, so just to be clear, like we're not like, let's say we're looking at the think pair share recipe. We're not saying that you don't do a good job with think pair share, right? Like again, I say to teachers, I don't know. You may be doing everything on here. You're probably doing at least some things on here, right? So let's just say, like, again, this is just about we're trying to figure out how to codify what we're all doing so that kids can get a equitable experience. So anyway, something like think pair share, I mean, it wouldn't take that long for a teacher to, even if they were unfamiliar with it. And again, most teachers do some type of turn and talk, think, pair, share to begin with. So it's not like they're starting from scratch. It wouldn't take that long for you to be pretty proficient and comfortable with that, for that to be basically become routine, where
Hmm.
you didn't have to devote a lot of your cognitive resources to it because you're like, okay, here's how we're going to do it. Something like consolidation is much harder, right? Because there's a lot more. You have to know more about the math. You have to manage student discourse. You have to manage engagement. So we probably wouldn't start with that for most teachers because the other thing too is, right? I mean, we want teachers to be successful. So we want to start in a place that feels like they can be successful with it because what we found is, and depending on the teacher, we have started, if you have a teacher that's really doing a lot of this stuff and they just want to kind of move to the next piece, we definitely can. We don't want to waste their time either. But something like think, pair, share, or we use the task and launch one a lot because also, the thinking too is like if you're not launching the task as effectively, that's going to maybe affect everything else that goes on. So maybe let's kind of like get to the source, right? And say like if we're over scaffolding the launch of the task or it's taking us 25 minutes to get kids working, then let's fix that before we talk about
Sure.
extensions or consolidation. But yeah, and so what happens is teachers, they do it, and it doesn't mean that, the other thing we try to frame for teachers is it's not about good or bad. Did it go good? Did it go bad? Because that's really the wrong question to be asking. We just want to know what we're learning.
Hmm.
So when we debrief, right, when we come back, when maybe folks have tried out a recipe for a week or two and they've kind of tried it out in their class, maybe with the support of the coach, maybe not, depending on what they want. We come back and we say like, all right, let's talk about this. It's never, around a good or bad thing. It's what did you learn? What are some things that we might need to, tweak? Um, were there any stumbling blocks that you encountered that we didn't think about? And that is a really interesting one because teachers will say they'll come up with things, and then what generally happens is some other teachers like, oh, I that happened to me, and here's what I did. And then you kind of get this almost knowledge mobility among teachers. And then people say, oh, really? And then we'll say, well, okay, do you want to run it next week and try that and see if that works for you? And they'd be like, oh, yeah, let's do that. And then I'd find myself, right, going to different schools and then I'd meet with a different group of teachers in a different school, and somebody would bring up the same thing, like, "Oh, I tried the think, pair, share, and this is a stumbling block." And if somebody didn't have, one of the teachers at the table didn't experience or that, or didn't have a, I'd be like, "Oh, well, I was just over at this school, and you know what they said they tried?" And so I was kind of like, and so that was kind of cool too. And so I think, yeah, there's really no barrier to entry, right? I mean, you want to just figure out like what was going to make most sense to where the teacher is, what's going to feel to them like, okay, I can do this. And the thing about the recipes too is we frame is you're doing all these things anyway. So it's not one more thing. Like you're going to launch a math task,
Right.
whether you do it this way or not. So I'm not asking you to do anything beyond, because we all know that teachers have absolutely no time for that. I'm just asking you to do the same thing you do, maybe in a slightly different way. And so I think that like resonated with teachers as well, because they're like, all
Hmm.
right, well, I'm going to do this anyway. So, all right, I'll try this 5 minute launch and let you know how it goes.
Right.
Right. Because all I'm asking you to do is commit to that. Or I'll do this think, pair, share routine during my number talk for 10 minutes and tell you how it goes. And then we try to build, right? And again,
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
engaging with the teacher. What feels good for
Right.
you, feels right for you.
Yeah.
Let us know, right? Tell us. And then we would try to
Baby
respond.
steps. Baby steps go a long way, right? So good tips there for sure. Tom, it's been great chatting you with about instructional recipes. Where can folks go if they want to learn a little bit more? Where can they go to can maybe contact you, or what kind of takeaway do you want to leave with these folks?
Well, definitely. I have a website for my consulting, which we can, I'm sure, link, TJ Ancora Consulting. It has all the recipes that we have are available there, free for people to try out. Also, my contact information, some other resources, because again, anyone who wants to talk further or has questions, I would encourage
Sure.
to reach. I also publish a Substack as well called The Core of the Matter, which is mainly it's about instruction, a lot about math instruction, sometimes not, but people can check that out as well. Um, so those are two places I would say.
Awesome. We'll link those up in the show notes. So if folks are listening and they want to kind of have a peek at what the instructional recipes have look like, or see the variety that are there, get on over there. You can click a link in the show notes. But Tom, thanks for joining us here.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Awesome stuff. Have a great day.